Afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the ISO, I'd like to welcome you to today's working group for Day-Ahead Market Enhancements, Extended Day-Ahead Market Configurable Parameters, Session 2. My name is Christina Guimera, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I will be facilitating today's meeting. Today's slide deck presentation is available on the initiative webpage. You can get to that page by going to kaiso.com, and then under the Stakeholder Center tab on the homepage, you'll see Policy Initiatives. If you click that link, it'll take you to our main initiative landing page where you can search for the initiative webpage. This meeting is being recorded and the video file will be posted to the initiative webpage for information and convenience purposes only. The recording and any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. If you need any technical assistance at any point during the meeting, please send a chat to Inteller Events, the host. To ask questions during the meeting, you can open the participant and chat panels on the bottom right. You can then raise your hand by selecting the raise hand icon, or if you joined audio only, please press *3 on your device. For everyone joining us today, please state your name and affiliation first before speaking, and you may also send comments and questions via chat to all panelists. And with that, I'll turn it over to Oswin Thomas to get us started.
Everyone, this is Oswin. So the objective of this second working group session for the configurable parameters is twofold. One is to address the written comments from the first session. And secondly, and based on the feedback provided in the written comments, this is to share the updated working group plan and timeline. So the responses to the comments are uploaded to the website and available to all. Next slide, Christina, please. Okay, and just to take a step back and to recap the items that were covered in the first session. So we committed to collaborating with the market participants to configure 5 key market parameters. So we call these the DAM-E configurable parameters. The first one is the set of enforced constraints for imbalance reserves. And these could be flow gates, nomograms, and contingencies. And then you have the proportion of the deployed imbalance reserves that has a starting value of 100%, which means all of the imbalance reserve procured are deliverable. And then we have the envelope constraints all the way to the right, envelope constraint multipliers, which have an initial value of 85. So this is because the IFM is, the day-ahead market is a forward-looking market. So when we have imbalance reserve that are being procured, we have to capture the effect of the SOC on these imbalance reserves. So we have an SOC envelope, and the SOC envelope have envelope constraint multipliers, out of which 85% is going to be used as a starting value. And then we have 2 other parameters, the bid cap and the default bid price for IR, which is 55 in the tariff. Okay. Next slide, Christine. Okay, on August 7th, we had our first session to kick off this working group. And this slide is capturing the timeline that was originally shared in that meeting. So based on the information that we had at that particular time, the market simulation was starting in around July, and that is why we had the basic analysis phase in map state setup and the first stakeholder meeting scheduled for Q1 of 2026. And we will, in the next few slides, we will see how this has changed now based on the comments that we received from participants on how we can accommodate more meetings and when the new market simulation timeline will start. Okay, next slide, Christine. Okay, after the first session of the working group, the ISO received 7 sets of written comments from the entities here. They fall broadly into 3 main categories. One is the timeline, where we received feedback that we require more working sessions, and then the scope of the effort itself, and comments regarding the details of how the parameters are set up. So in the next few slides, I will go over the timeline and the adjusted timeline that we have, and we'll hand it over to Guillermo to cover the remaining portion of the presentation. Okay, next slide, Christina. Okay, here we have the updated timeline, and a common request that we saw was to extend the timeline of the working group effort, and by starting earlier than what was originally proposed, and also to accommodate additional working group sessions. So we've assessed this request and are accommodating this request by adjusting the timeline as follows. So the next session will now be a kickoff session in August 2025. This will be before the market simulation actually starts, and this will set the stage and explain what is going to come next, and we will realign at that point. The market simulation is now going to start in September, and from September, we have market simulation going for 3 months, and the next working group session after the August one will be in October. And from October, we have 6 sessions now compared to the 3 proposed sessions that we had in the original meeting. So previously, the 3 sessions overlapped only the parallel operations phase, but now we will have these sessions overlap both the market simulation and the parallel operations phase. Okay. Next slide, Christina. So let me elaborate on how the schedule is set up. First of all, this working group effort for the configurable parameters is part of a master plan that we have for both the DAMI and the EDAM project. This is not an isolated process. So part of that master schedule includes steps for both market simulation and for parallel operations. It so happens that the working group sessions overlap with both market simulation and parallel operation, but they are independent efforts. And the main underlying reason to start the working group effort until the second half of 2025 is because that is when the market simulation starts. And the start of the market simulation is usually the time when the market application will be functional and readily available to perform analysis. Although the effort for the working group will happen alongside market simulation, it is a parallel effort and will not affect the market simulation process. The working group will plan to leverage on market simulation and parallel operations to perform further analysis on these parameters. Okay. Next slide, Christina. Okay, on this slide, we have more details on how we envision the working group sessions and how it is organized along with market simulation and parallel operations. So the market simulation will be performed using the initial values of the configurable parameters that we just discussed. And then the working group will rely on the study cases. So think of this as snapshots from the market simulation environment to generate cases and perform sensitivity analysis. And then we will review and continue to assess the analysis and present them in these working group sessions. And once the analysis are reviewed and feedback is received, fine-tuned values of these parameters after the market simulation will now feed in to the parallel operations phase of the project. And we will do the similar thing again in parallel operations, where we would take snapshots of parallel operations cases. And these cases, we believe, will provide an additional level of study cases with potentially higher quality of data. And then once we review the cases from the parallel operations, and after the sensitivity analysis is also obtained from parallel operations, we will again get a chance to discuss with the working group 3 more times. And then after these 6 sessions, I think we will be in a good place to provide a final assessment and to tune these values for go live. We believe that throughout these 6 working group sessions, we will have reports that will be shared with the working group. At this point, I'll turn it over to Guillermo from slide 11. So,
Before we switch over, we just have a hand raised.
sure.
If you'd like to take a moment.
Yes, please.
Yes, we have a hand raised by Chun Yu.
Go ahead, you're unmuted.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. This is Chun Yu from PG&E. I have a question. So it looks like your approach also now with this configurable parameter exercise, it's going to be heavily based on who it's going to be. I mean, how many people are going to be participate in the market sim? How can KAISO, I'm just thinking from the data perspective, you will need a full set of data in the market sim and full participation in the market sim in order to see a very truthful outcome. And how can you ensure that it's a full participation of the market sim from market participants? I'm just very curious, when you doing this switch or maybe taking this approach, whether you actually assess what kind of market sim outcome you might see. I think that's the very fundamental question.
Mm-hmm. So specifically, in the following slides, we do have some comments regarding the exact footprint that we will be using in the market simulation on map stage. But at a high level, market simulation will be the starting point for us to begin these analysis. So we do agree that the quality of data will not be as close to production or even parallel operations, but whatever we have in market simulation, we will use that, take those snapshots, and perform sensitivity analysis.
I see. All right. So is there any chance you guys going to see any data into the market sim before the market sim begin?
Before the market sim officially begins, the data that we will have will be made up data. So that's why we were not inclined to begin these analysis before the market simulation started. That is why we wanted to wait for market simulation to begin generating these cases. But yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much for helping me understand the approach. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you.
Next up, we have another hand raised by Alva.
Alva, you're unmuted.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, this is sort of a follow-up on Chun Yu's comment. Just one thing that in looking at these parameters, there can be one judgment you can make is whether the market can function, whether they're stable. But some of these parameters have significant effects on market awards and revenues, in particular the constraint, the parameters around the imbalance reserves. And it's hard to make an argument about whether like these values should be lower or higher without having no evidence. We can make arguments on principles or whatever. That was one of the things I think we're hoping for, and what Chun Yu was kind of mentioning in terms of what we would expect you to have some access to before market sim. And I mean, I'm not saying that we have to be involved in testing that, but we'd really like to know that you've done some sensitivity prior to market sim where you really are confident that you think, for example, that you need 85% as the value of that you're going to essentially constrain storage by in awarding them imbalance reserves. Because some of these numbers, were from what we, just from the process, they're essentially pulled out of a hat. I mean, they're plausible on the face of them, but they weren't really. There's no strong justification for them. So it would be great if you could provide some information about sensitivity. I think Guillermo usually does that whenever he has data to that effect, that we could have confidence going into market simulation that you've actually looked at them in terms of sensitivity and edge cases and stuff that we may not see in market simulation. So thank you.
Yeah, Oswin, if I can take on that question.
Sure.
Thank you Laura, for the question. Yeah, this is a very interesting setup that we have because, as you indicated, right, we don't have actual data until we actually go live, right? So one easy way to address the issue of the data quality is to do this until we go live and we just stay with some numbers. And obviously that is not the expectation that motivated the creation of the working groups. And there is value to do all this sensitivity analysis, making sure that the functionality is working as expected based on the information that we have. Now, before or after simulation, the reality is that we will not have actual bid information for imbalance reserves, right? We can have some assumptions what the bids are going to be, but until they start flowing into the systems by participants, anything is going to be a second guess of what the value should be. So that is not going to be a challenge just before going into market simulation. It's going to be as we enter market simulation. And that was originally the motivation. We have to really try to do all the assessment until we reach the parallel operation. That is when we are going to have the best quality of the data to make any assessments. But here is the trade-off that we are trying to accommodate for participants to provide as much information as possible, as early as possible. The complication that we have is, at the end of the day, what data is available. And in order to generate cases prior to market simulation, we have to come with some assumptions of what data is going to be. We don't know exactly what the bid information should be as we go live, so we have to make assumptions of what the bids are going to be. And we are going to be able to generate some study cases based on that predefined data. And that is as best as we can do in lieu of having this timeline before going to the actual production environment. The reason we have this kickoff session scheduled for August 2025 is precisely as you asked for, to have this initial point to assess how things are looking, how we are assessing just with very specific study cases to get the better reference how things could play for market simulation. Now, as Oswin stated earlier, the plan is that we are going to start market simulation with the original values that are already defined. Whether it should be 85% or 80 versus 90 is subject to discussion and is no more than a second best guess. And we have to start from somewhere. And this is how we are trying to programmatically go through the challenge of getting access to better quality of the data as we progress in the effort. And that also tries to find the balance to inform the community through this working group effort of what we are seeing as early as is feasible, right? We wish we could do this now and be done. Unfortunately, we don't have the market application, the functionality to be able to do any analysis until it's in a robust fashion that we can be confident that we can rely on the market results. So everything is part of a bigger picture here of the master plan of the implementation process. And I would appreciate that the participants could appreciate the boundaries that we have to operate within, given all these challenges that we have with the functionality, with the market application, the system, the setup, and the data that could be available.
Thank you, Guillermo. Could we perhaps, I think one place to would be intermediate would be that we have enough access to as much of the study cases that you're going to discuss in August with some advance notice so we can review the data, and if possible, if that data can be as detailed as possible, where we can essentially explore it so that we can ask challenging questions in that meeting. But I think that I understand now why you're saying what it's possible to do, that you'll have some study cases done, but they may not be, well, obviously they're not going to be the same as the market, but you may have drawn some conclusions from them, and it would be good for us to be able to look at that data as well. So thank you. Appreciate how you've described it.
Yeah, thank you, Ivan. And yes, we will accommodate that request to provide as much data as we can.
seeing any further questions, so I'll turn it back over to you, Guillermo, for the next slide.
Yes, we should be in the slide number 11. Now, in addition to the timeline that was the common denominator in the comments that we received, we also have a set of comments and requests regarding the scope of the effort. A scope in terms of specifically what parameters we are going to be assessing. When the ISO committed to this working group effort at the end of the policy development phase, it was very targeted to account for these specific 5 parameters that are described at the beginning of the presentation. That is the scope. Now, granted, as part of the overall assessment that we're going to be doing, obviously we're going to be assessing other dynamics, other interplays that may have a role in defining these and other parameters. But the scope that we are putting the boundary for this working group is specifically to the 5 parameters that we committed to do through the effort at the end of the policy development. We received a few comments regarding additional requests, additional parameters for consideration. And we are highlighting here the main ones, the most significant ones. And you have the detailed set of comments and responses that we provided to each of those in the companion document that is posted on the website. The first one is that there was a comment request if, as part of this working group effort, we were exploring to consider using or not using the ROC market power mitigation process that is going to be part of the EDAM. I believe a participant may have seen that there is a parameter to control the activation of that NPM process. I can tell you that flag, if available, is really mostly for internal system processing. It's not because we are considering the flexibility to run ROC with or without NPM. The expectation is that we are going to be always running ROC NPM followed by ROC is part of the functionality. And that is not subject to further assessment in this scope of the working group. The second common request was regarding a parameter that potentially could be utilized to model the impact or the usage of imbalance reserve in the management of the hydro energy limit. We have this limit that tells you that within the period analyzing, the total energy has to be below the energy limitation, the energy quota. And there is now a component that accounts for the potential usage of the imbalance reserve. That imbalance reserve effect is basically considered 100%. If 100 megawatts are associated with imbalance reserve, 100 megawatts is going to be considered in the energy limitation. The question was if there should be some type of attenuation, a scaling factor to account for different levels of imbalance reserve effect. The functionality that we are implementing doesn't have that parameter. The policy development didn't account or explore the possibility for that parameter, and therefore it is not within the scope of this working group. As part of the overall assessment, we are going to be monitoring the dispatch of every single type of resources, including hydro resources. And yes, this could be one area that we're going to closely monitor to see if there is any additional action that we may take based on the findings that we have from this exercise. But from the beginning, we are not exploring new parameters to influence the accounting of the imbalance reserve for the hydro energy limitation. The third topic was about a comment regarding the consideration or the assessment of the zonal versus the nodal deliverability for imbalance reserves. During the policy development, there was extensive discussion about the comparison of zonal versus nodal approach. I can tell you the final policy, the process that we're implementing is based on a nodal approach. That is a threshold that we already passed and is and is pointed in the policy work that we did. Now, the discussion is more about the level of the nodal development that we could implement. Whether we are implementing 50% of the constraints or 75% of the constraints may mean how nodal it can go. But still, it is a nodal. It's not by virtue of less constraints becoming a zonal approach. It's still a nodal with more or less constraints. Part of the assessment that we're going to be doing is precisely the level of constraints, the amount of constraints, the set of constraints that we can actually enforce, having in mind the trade-off between getting the best deliverability assessment that we can when clearing for imbalance reserves, while making sure that the market is able to run on time given the extra burden in the computational effort that it may take by adding more and more constraints to the assessment of the imbalance reserve deliverability. That is the scope that we have in mind, to the extent of the set of constraints that we can enforce, not whether it's going to be a nodal versus zonal approach. Cristina, let's pause if we have any questions on this item before we move to the next one.
I'm not seeing any questions at this time.
Okay, next slide, please, slide number 12. There was another common request if the imbalance reserve, the direction of the imbalance reserve is going to be treated explicitly in the effort, and the answer is yes. The imbalance reserve up or down somehow is defined to be kind of different products. So there will be a parameter for each direction, and each one is going to be assessed. The last two parameters that were listed at the beginning has to do with the value of $55, is the cap and the bid curve. These values are already defined in the tariff. They are there because of a lengthy discussion and process in the policy stage. And there was some confusion, even to ourselves. We were defining what the goal of this working group would be relative to these two specific parameters. The fact that these two parameters are already defined in the tariff really sets a higher standard. Now, the expectation is that the ISO is not intending to change these parameters through this working group effort. And even if we find merit to make a potential change to these parameters, it has to go through a stakeholder process dedicated to assess these two parameters. So the expectation is that we're going to go live with these $55 parameters for these two specific values. And we will assess, we will continue to assess the dynamics of the market after go live, after we have actual bidding information for imbalance reserve, and we understand how the market is clearing. So that will give us the best reference to assess if there is a need for potential changes to these specific parameters of the $55. And overall, the ISO is open and recognizes the need to do a more holistic assessment of the whole functioning of the market with these parameters set up. And we are going to continue to do that assessment even after go live, once we have more relevant information to potentially further tune these parameters. Next slide, Cristina. Okay, the third theme of comments and questions that we got is about more the details of how we set up the parameters. One of the questions is about how we're going to socialize the information, the analysis that we have. And the participants that are going to be defined for the effort are effectively the balancing areas of the ISO and PAC. All the systems are going to be configured during this stage with these two balancing areas. The information that is going to be available is related to these two balancing areas. And typically, what we do for this type of analytics is that we provide a specific analysis report across a set of metrics and indices. That will continue to be the case. We will ensure that the data is available at a level of granularity that doesn't pose any sensitivity issues for any of the participating areas. The second question was more about how we're going to memorialize the parameters. Well, through this process, we're going to come with potentially adjusted values for use in parallel operations coming from the assessment of the market simulation. We're going to communicate through the project process before going into parallel operations what the final values are going to be. Once we complete the assessment in parallel operations, we are going to come with the final values that are going to be used for the go live. These values are going to be defined in both the business practice manuals, at least for those that are not related to the $55. The ones that are already defined in the tariff are already set there for $55, but all of them are going to be also memorialized in the business practice manual. The other comment that we got is about the footprint that is going to be used for the EDAM. The selection of the footprint for this effort is not isolated. It's not something that is defined just by the merits of the working group needs. It's actually based on the setup and the configuration of the overall project. By the time we go live, it's going to be based on CAISO and PAC balancing areas. Therefore, all the preceding effort of the market simulation and parallel operations are going to be set up and configured with these two balancing areas. Therefore, all the information, all the analysis and assessment that we're going to be doing for the configurable parameters is going to be predicated on these two balancing areas that compose the footprint for the exercise. Again, this is not a choice taken lightly just based on the needs of the working group. It's just going with the flow of what is set up and configured in the overall implementation of the DIM EDAM by the time we are doing this exercise, that is the time of the market simulation and parallel operations. Christina, can we see if we have any comments, questions?
I'm not seeing any questions coming in at this moment.
Okay.
We just got a hand raised by Dan Williams.
Yes, please.
Dan, you're now unmuted.
Hey, Guillermo, Dan Williams from the Energy Authority. So just on that point about the areas, am I correct that then any entities that are going to participate in the Pacific Core Market Sim, would that be included in this analysis? So not just Pacific Core, but any third-party loads, resources?
Correct. Correct. Everything that is part of the area that is in the scope of the first stage will be available.
Okay, and then maybe just a technical refresher on this. So if I'm remembering correctly, and I haven't looked at it in 2 years, so hang with me, but if I'm remembering correctly, the imbalance reserves are calculated at the BA level, distributed to the nodal generation level based on the expected imbalance requirement from different resources. So you'd expect sort of areas that are heavily renewable dominant to be to maybe have more of an imbalance requirement. Is there a zonal versus nodal relationship when it comes to the granularity of the assessment of load within the areas? And I asked that question just because I had kind of heard that we would just be looking at like a PAC East and a PAC West bubble for the load granularity, but maybe have more differentiation within the CAISO BA. Could you maybe share a little bit on some of the behind the scenes stuff on how you'd be looking at the resource and load granularity for the non-CAISO areas?
Yeah, I hear you, Dan, but I'm not sure to follow fully what the question is about. What I can tell you that we have the requirements defined for the region, for each balancing area. There are diversity benefits, and when it comes to the nodal working functionality that we have, we decompose between among load, wind, and solar, right? And obviously, that is going to be highly determined by the mix of each balancing area. If there is an area that is heavy on solar, you could see some interplay there, but at the end, it's still predicated on the mix of each balancing area. Whether there could be a few or more balancing areas as part of the footprint, that is only going to influence the level of the diversity.
Okay. Yeah, that actually does kind of answer the question, but I'll try and refine it a little bit, make it a little more clear in comments if we end up doing those or follow up offline. But that does help, and also just good to hear that all flavors of participants will be a part of the market simulation effort as long as they're ready and participating.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. And yes, please submit any questions you may have, and if you have more granular questions, I'm happy to address those.
Thanks.
Do you have any other questions,
I'm not seeing
Christina?
any other questions. Yeah, I'm not
Okay.
seeing any other questions coming in yet.
Let's move to the next slide, the number 14. And this is one of the questions that we are going to be able to provide more details until we are closer to the kickoff session of August. And that is effectively what are the elements that we're going to be assessing in this working group when it comes to the assessment of the parameters. Well, effectively everything, because we really want to ensure that we have a good assessment of the overall market functionality, the new features, the existing features, and how they interplay. So generally, we're going to be looking at the schedules, prices, the interplay between different market products, among the commodities, the procurement and the deployment of imbalance reserves, the transfers, that is obviously a key component of the construct of the EDAM. As we get closer and closer and be able to put our hands on the functionality of the market, we're going to be able to build the metrics and be able to provide more information as it comes closer to the August kickoff session. The last question captures a few items that came through the 7 sets of comments, and that is about how confident, how robust the conclusions can be from this working group, realizing that the quality of the data that is going to be utilized, whether it's market simulation or parallel operations, may not be at par with the actual quality that we typically see in the production environment. Yeah, that is a limitation. That is one price to pay for doing something before going live and having real data. And that is a limitation, a boundary that we have to operate within. That said, that is part of the motivation. We are taking this two-step approach. That we start with simulation, we do some tuning. As we progress towards parallel operations, the quality is going to be better because parallel operations can be as close as possible to actual production before going into actual production. So that gives us an opportunity to calibrate as needed once we have better quality of the data. And yeah, any determination we have to make about the final values is going to be predicated on the quality of the data that we have. We are cognizant of that limitation, but at the end, we need to balance that with the need to perform this holistic assessment, not only of each specific parameters, but of the overall market functionality when all these parameters are interplaying among each other. And I can tell you and guarantee you that this is not a finite effort. This is indeed the beginning, because once we go live, this assessment, this calibration will continue to be like what we currently do for any other parameter that is in place in the market. It's part of the natural feedback loop that we have in our processes for continuous improvement of the market functionality. And that's all what we have. Again, if you want to see the specific comments and responses, they are also posted in the website of this initiative, and they are very granular. One by one, you can see the comments and questions and responses that we have. If there are any questions, Christine, I think this is a good time. Otherwise, that's all what we have for today.
Guillermo, I'm not seeing any questions coming in. Yeah, no questions at this moment.
Okay, thank you, Christina. That's all what we have.
Okay, great. Thank you, Guillermo. Oh, we just got one quick question come in from Chunyu.
All right, Chunyu, you are unmuted.
Thank you. I'm sorry. It's been a while, and I tried to look at, this is Chunyu from PG&E, look at what question we had, and we haven't seen from what you just presented. I believe we also have some question about the set of transmission constraint enforced in a deployment scenario during market sim. Is there something you can answer now, or is it something it will be shared later before the market sim starts?
Yes, and I recall the question, and the response is provided in the companion document. And you can look at that one. What I can respond now, based on my recollection, is that the question about what transmission constraints to enforce, the exploration we are doing that is very similar to what we have been doing for the flexible ramping product is not much about what specific constraint, but the type of constraints that we can enforce. We have effectively three types of constraints. Flow gates that capture the typical thermal limitation of physical elements. We have nomograms that are more sophisticated limitations that account for some type of security condition. And then we have the standard contingencies. These are the N-1 contingencies that you have to protect one element in case you lose another element. And the view that we have seen, at least for FRP, is that we started with the growth of the constraints, that is the flow gates. Then eventually we implemented that for nomograms. And in the recent time, we have been assessing the activation for contingencies. These are really the sets that are in the scope for imbalance reserve. Obviously, we want to ensure that we have consistency between day ahead and real time. And that will be part of the assessment that we want to have. Can we afford to have all these three types of constraints? If there is a limitation that happens to be because of the computational effort, then we may have to go into the assessment of, out of all this set of constraints, are there some that are more critical than others? And that may be mostly area specific. That is still part of the scope of the analysis and the discussion we will have during the working sessions.
That's very helpful, Guillermo. So one more follow-up question on those three sets of constraints. They are, assume they are dynamic, isn't it, or are they static?
They are largely static. We enable those constraints, we enforce those constraints, and they stay there. There may be some variation for the contingencies because the contingencies may be subject to or may be predicated on some specific outages. That may be the only subset of constraints that may be more dynamic.
Thank you. This is very helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We have one more question that came in from Alpha.
Yeah, and I think this is probably my oversight. I had understood prior to this meeting, and I think I may just have missed an announcement that the market sim was going to begin in June. You've now said it's going to begin in August, and I also may have missed the timeline at the beginning of the slide set. But when is parallel operations beginning now, and what is the current expectation for go live?
Yes, good day, Alba. And let me clarify, and I think Frank may be also in the call and she can elaborate more. You are right. When we have the first discussion back in August, we were relying on the timeline that was available back at then. And at that time, the plan was to have the formal market simulation somewhere in August, and then parallel operations to still be in Q1 2026. There has been some changes, not because of the working group and configurable parameters, but because of the master plan of the EDAM, and the schedule has been revised for the market simulation. So the market simulation is going to happen now somewhere in, I believe that is September, and it's going to go through the end of the year, and parallel operation remains the same. Again, that is a change of the master schedule. Is not something specific or driven by the working group of the configurable parameters.
Understood. So you're still aiming at the same go live date and the same parallel operations date, but you're starting market simulation a month later than the previous date that you had there.
Correct.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm not seeing any other questions at this time. Guillermo, did you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, thank you so much for the feedback. It was very useful to recalibrate expectations and adjust our plans. Hopefully with this extended effort that now goes basically from October through March, that provides enough time and opportunities for participants to participate in this effort. And otherwise, we're going to be talking to you back in next August when we kick off the process. Thank you so much.
Perfect, thank you. I just have a quick announcement slide before we wrap up. For insights into the ISO grid and market operations, be on the lookout for our Energy Matters blog, or you can always subscribe. Here you can see some of our latest blog posts. And with that, we'd like to thank you so much for joining today's discussion. As a reminder, this meeting was recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. The video file will be posted on the initiative webpage. We thank you so much, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using IntelliEvent services. You may now disconnect.